say we're on.
Are we on right now?
Oh, start? Okay. Oh, all right. So, good afternoon and welcome to the CERIAS seminar series. It's my great pleasure to have Professor Golden Rashar from the University of New Orleans today. So, when it comes to malware analysis and digital forensics, Golden is the man. So I'm happy that he's he comes visit Purdue in his very busy schedule. And Professor Rashar is a professor of computer science and university research professor and director of the Greater New Orleans Center for Information Assurance at the University of New Orleans. Professor Rashar received his PhD in computer science from the Ohio State University in 1995, and he has 35 years of experience in computer systems and computer security. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, a member of the United States Secret Service Cybercrime Task Force, and chairman of the board of directors of DFRWS. This is one of the top conferences devoted to digital forensic research. And his research interests mirror his teaching interests, including digital forensics, reverse engineering, offensive computing, operating systems internals, and malware analysis.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, thanks for coming. This is sort of an interesting melding of two things that I'm interested in, memory analysis and GPU malware. That's me. So I do university stuff and private digital forensics investigations and computer security research. And instead of sleeping at night, I also do music photography. So there it is. So one thing I teach students in introductory reverse engineering classes is that malware used to be a lot different than it is now. It was still, old school malware was still potentially dangerous, erased hard drives and did bad stuff, but a lot of it was just hacking exercises. And you found malware that didn't really have very dangerous payloads and just allowed people to experiment with hard hacking problems. What you see now is monetized and targeted and weaponized malware that's being used not only by individuals but by nation states to attack other people. And the skills with a Z is turned into skills with multiple dollar signs because you can now go and find websites where you can pay for malware to be developed to do nasty stuff to people that you don't want to be around anymore. The good news is we have better tools than we had before. So we have things like memory analysis and even commercial tools for doing reverse engineering of malware. But there's some new types of malware which are emerging that we really don't have good tools for. And so this talk is primarily about encouraging interest in new areas of malware research. So I hope you'll catch the bug and be interested in that. So one thing that you're interested in when you do malware analysis is the category that the malware fits into. I try to discourage students from caring too much about the categories because you end up in arguments about whether it's a virus or a worm or whatever, and it really doesn't matter except when you're trying to speak the technical jargon. What's really more important are the effects of the malware and vulnerable targets and other things. And so when you do malware analysis, you typically have a checklist, right? You want to know what it does, whether it's persistent, are you going to get rid of it by rebooting, does it communicate with other computers, really importantly, what data has been affected, modified, deleted, or exfiltrated. So I worked on a private case recently for a savings and loan that had actually been attacked by Chinese malware, and the worry was that some really sensitive financial data that's there had been potentially compromised, and it turns out that all that had really happened is all the computers in the savings and loan had turned into botnet slaves, right? So that's good news for them actually. They were happy to serve spam for a few days. And didn't actually have any damage beyond that. So that's interesting. And so one tool that's used in malware detection and mitigation is digital forensics. So many people see the word digital forensics and think of CSI and other kinds of things where it's primarily, legal and stuff like that. But digital forensics has a real role to play in malware detection and analysis, because in capturing all the traditionally non-volatile data off of a computer system, you get information that can let you figure out how the malware is made persistent. That's stuff that's in, for example, the Windows registry. You might get copies of binaries, and maybe even, if you're really lucky, some source code and stuff from a traditional forensics examination. So traditional storage forensics that deals with the contents of hard drives and thumb drives and stuff like that has been around a really long time. Of course, some digital forensics investigators are computer scientists, and so I'm not sure why it took so long for the realization that, wow, every time we pull the plug, we're losing amazing amounts of evidence. But in, say, 2004, I have some examples coming up soon, live forensics memory analysis was hardly robust, right? We ran strings against things, basically, and that's all we had. There's a lot of information in RAM that can aid in malware analysis, and so memory analysis is a really important aspect. So for traditional malware, we already have nice memory analysis tools that can help you detect it and see what data has been exfiltrated or affected or whatever. It'll turn out that sort of non-traditional malware like GPU malware, which I'll talk about later in the talk, basically break all our tools, as you'll see. Okay. So how many people know all about memory analysis already? So like volatility and tools like that, just to see. How many people have done any GPU programming at all, using CUDA or something? And how many people have seen GPU malware, like in the flesh? That's okay. That's kind of what I was hoping for. That's great. So the traditional memory analysis workflow, in case you're not familiar with it, is use some mechanism for capturing memory from a system. So for virtual environments, you're really lucky, because facilities like the suspend and snapshot stuff that's in VMware Workstation and VMware Fusion, when you suspend a virtual machine, you get this nice physical memory snapshot file that can be run right through memory analysis tools like volatility. So capturing memory dumps for analysis really means pressing a button to suspend the VM and you're home free. On physical hardware, you need to run programs to do memory dumping, but once you have the memory dump, then you can analyze it using lots of different tools. And in the very beginning, around 2005, that's the beginning of memory analysis as a real discipline. There was a bunch of fragmented tools. You had one-off tools being developed, like someone would write something interesting in Perl, and you can dump process lists using that, and someone else would write some other tool, and they're all incompatible, and you end up with a big tool chest. Things have really sort of moved and coalesced, and so now it's traditional to add new memory analysis capabilities to the field as a whole by just writing new plugins for volatility or one of the similar frameworks like that. So there's some new memory analysis you want to do. You just hack up your Python plugin, stick it into volatility, and everyone benefits from that, that effort. Once you have the memory dump and you've done your analysis, what comes out of the other side is really interesting evidence. That includes things like from a dead memory dump, what processes were running on the machine, what processes may have terminated recently, what processes were hidden. So if you have things like direct kernel object manipulation, DCOM stuff, you can detect those things rapidly. You can see what network connections were open, what files were open. There are portions of the Windows registry, if you're on a Windows box, that are only volatile. They're memory branches of the tree, and so you won't find those things on disk at all. And you can find encryption, keying material, and chat messages, and email fragments, and the contents of the clipboard, and your bash history, and all kinds of stuff that's in the memory dump. So in 2004, memory analysis looked like this, really. You have a physical memory device like devmem, and you grep -i some keyword on it, murder in this case, and you see some information pop out that doesn't have very good context, because what's physical memory, right? It's a collection of 4K pages in essentially random order that don't have any context. So it's kind of awesome if, you know, the person that was killed is named Sally, and you see something like that, but you have to be careful that it's not, you know, fragments of some book about murdering a hamster named Sally or something like that. So really had nothing going on at all. So around 2005, Digital Forensics Research Conference, which is DFRWS.org, put out a forensic challenge where memory dumps were released, and there weren't any tools really, and it was like, well, here's some memory dumps, write some tools. We saw a response to that, that effort that was really promising, and so subsequent forensic challenges, these are usually released around the time of the conference, and you have about a year to go and write some interesting tools to tackle the forensic scenario. In 2006, more and more memory analysis stuff started to come out. You saw the beginnings of the volatility framework that everyone uses now. So things really, really changed. That work starting in 2005 has now gotten to the point where you see, and just a anti-commercial disclaimer, I was a technical editor on this book. My student is one of the co-authors and co-developers of Volatility. I don't make any money, so it's an awesome book, and you should at least have a look at it in your library or something.
And one of the co-authors is Purdue grad, Aaron Walters.
Yeah, Aaron Walters. All four of those guys that wrote the book are really smart, and we've gotten to the point where from strings in 2004, we now have a 900-page book on memory analysis, where there's no fluffy stuff in there, and the book is concerned a little bit with research and how to expand the state of the art, but you can really think of it as 900 pages of facts about memory analysis that we can already do. So we moved from one or two commands that are not even really aimed at memory analysis, like grep and strings and stuff, right, to something that's pretty amazing. So now we can, for example, take a machine, a virtualized environment where we imagine that some nefarious activities are occurring, some malware is hidden and stuff like that, and literally snapshot it with one with one click, run some volatility scripts. I'm not sure how the zoom is going to work here, but the idea is that I can zoom and let you see. You see a process here, and there's various detection mechanisms running across the edge that show whether the process appears to be in whatever data structures are referenced there. And you see that probably direct kernel object manipulation has been employed here to hide one of those processes that's in the list. So you know that immediately without a whole bunch of investigation. So 10 years ago, you'd be pulling your hair out and trying to figure out how to find this stuff. Now in 10 seconds, you'll know whether you have that thing or not. This is from a real case where one party was being abused because the other party had purchased commercial spyware and placed it on her computer without her knowledge. And the only way she suspected that this was there is that she saw a $99 charge on her credit card. Contacted her attorney contacts me, we take her machine, we just run it through a nice tool chain and bring up a copy of her machine in a VM, do a little bit of stuff. Anytime you see the skulls on my slides, it means defocus your eyes and concentrate on the idea and not on the code. But the point is, from her physical machine to a virtual machine where we do some memory dumping to a bunch of volatility commands, bling, there's the password that protects that commercial spyware. And now we know the person who installed it, and that person is up on federal wiretapping charges for installing spyware on someone's computer without their knowledge. And, yeah, it's a good outcome. It didn't require reverse engineering the software or doing any really laborious effort that the person wouldn't have been able to afford. Instead, it's just a little bit of know-how, a few volatility commands, and bling, there it is. We can also do things like, and this is some work I did at DFRWS for this year, we can do things like, how many people have heard of the compressed RAM facility in Mac OS X Mavericks? So Mac OS X and modern versions of the Linux kernel now, to avoid swapping, instead of swapping physical pages to disk when there's memory pressure, they actually just compress the pages and stick them away in a little region of hoarded memory. You can do something like look at the Mac OS X virtual memory system that comprises maybe like 75,000 lines of C or something. It's pretty daunting, but there's a pathway through there for compressing and decompressing those pages that end up in physical memory. In order to make those pages magically and transparently decompress so that forensic tools will see the data that's there, just like if it was uncompressed, you can model this process, which is complicated to understand, but you can model this process in 1,000 lines of Python or something, and model all these data structures in Python, and then have tools that accurately work against memory dumps that have compressed regions. So to see this sort of visually, in case it's weird, look at the physical memory dump at the top. The red stuff is the area of physical memory that's dedicated to the compressor. Those are compressed pages. If you just look at this physical memory dump, you'll see that there are apparently regions, the white regions, that don't have any contents. Those are swapped out. But lucky you, if the swapping isn't actually to disk, but is just to the compressor, it means there's a copy of that page in the red block, right? If you decompress that stuff, you can transform the memory dump to look like this and fill in the holes. Not all the holes, but some of them. And so when you look at the address spaces of individual processes that you dump out, you're basically filling in some missing stuff that you wouldn't have gotten before, right? And the outcome, just to see some practical results, is that the data that's all here, now I made it interesting by running interesting things, right? Because otherwise you fall asleep. But the data that you see there, the bad poetry and silly pictures, and the fact that for some reason Flickr uses ASCII art inside of its web pages and all that stuff, those things are were all compressed and would have been completely passed over by tools that didn't do decompression. We're getting to the GPU malware thing, but I just have to do my usual plug here. Python's cool for writing security tools. Volatility requires pure Python, so you can't have C portions and stuff like that. So we basically had to take a pretty serious performance hit on that memory analysis work. I now am I have the lucky title of having written the slowest volatility memory analysis plugin ever written on Earth. And that's because Apple, in Mac OS 10.9 Mavericks, implemented the compression and decompression of those pages using hand-optimized assembler. So if you think the assembler isn't still important, it is important. That thing can do 250,000 compression decompression cycles per second. That's 4K pages on an i7. It's super fast. If you write that same thing in C, you get about half that performance. If you write it in Go, which is something you should check out if you're looking for languages that are not offensive, it's about half of that. And when you write it in Python, it looks like a splatter. Okay, so that's just the way it is. This is not Python's domain, compression and decompression code, so that's what you're stuck with. The point is, though, you can take very complicated problems in memory analysis and phrase them in Python and put them in volatility and build on all the other fantastical research that Andrew Case and Aaron Walters and all those other guys have done, and do it really rapidly in a few days rather than starting from scratch. So in 2005, doing the stuff I just talked about would have been a mind-bending experience. Now it's pretty easy. So here's the shift to GPU malware, and there is a relationship. I'll point it out soon. If you've done GPU programming, then you've already seen that GPUs are pretty amazing. So these are the processors that are in your graphics cards. So just to flip to the concrete example for a minute, you can spend $150, and volume drives this, right? You can spend $150 for a card that you can plug into your computer system, which is essentially a mini supercomputer, right? It's got 640 1 gigahertz cores, 2 gig of dedicated RAM, and tons of internal memory bandwidth. It's really amazingly fast. So GPUs are basically semi-autonomous computer systems that you have access to for not much money, and you're going to get them for free is the point, whether you want to spend the money or not. When you buy a new computer system, it's invariably going to have some GPU in it. They have lots of processing power. The current generation of NVIDIA graphics cards, memory is retained across warm reboots. That's important for malware. If you warm cycle your computer system, all 2 gig of RAM, or the vast majority of it, stays in place. So if you stuff information into GPU RAM and then reboot, it's still there. So when you pull power completely, of course, it's gone. But you have something like a 2 gig, very dangerous to use thumb drive for free that just sticks around. Memory sticks around. That GPU memory is completely separate, and really importantly, modern GPUs have really first-class DMA capabilities, so you can actually transfer data to and from host memory without the involvement of the CPU. So if you look at a chart, this is skewed because this is floating point performance, right? That $150 card I showed you just now is a peak performance of 1.7 teraflops. That's 1.7 trillion floating operations per second. When I started computing, this would have been an amazing number that I would have never thought would ever be possible. These other cards are more expensive, but they have huge amounts of power. So you're seeing basically the blue line Intel, popular Intel chips, and the graphics card stuff is just flying off the chart. So to do programming of graphics cards, use CUDA or OpenCL or whatever. I'm just flashing this slide. The presentation is going to be online. You can see it soon. The point is you can write graphics applications in C. You don't have to do something fancy. You used to have to do something fancy. So if you look back at this chart, have a look at this pixel snort thing here. This was a research attempt. How many people have seen the pixel snort paper? Anybody? This was an attempt on early graphics cards to accelerate snort, the intrusion detection system, by offloading pattern matching, basically pushing network packets through the graphics card, doing pattern matching to find intrusion, evidence of intrusion. If you read a section from that paper, you see how hard graphics programming was 10 years ago. You see that they're encoding packets and making those textures and uploading them into the graphics cards and doing some crazy stuff and then checking occlusion to see if geometric surfaces overlap. And it's really a crazy nightmare of programming. It didn't have much performance improvement, but that paper really started people on the track of trying to use GPUs to do defensive computer security tools that are fast, right? So the point is now GPU malware exists whether you like it or not. So it exists in paper form in front of you, and it exists in the wild. We've seen examples of it, and it exists in academic papers that have described it already. GPUs are attractive for development of malware for a bunch of reasons. One, you have tons of compute power that's not being used otherwise in general, right? You have 640 cores that are mostly just sitting there if you're in a GUI environment with a few windows open and not running a 3D game. You can implement fast pattern matching stuff, and because of DMA, you can snoop on kernel structures and other areas in RAM without really revealing that you're there. We don't have, unless you know of some, we don't really have any publicly released analysis tools for GPU malware. So the purpose of all this talking today is because we're trying to do something again in 2014 and 2015, like the 2005 DFRWS challenge, by posing some hard problems involving GPU malware and encouraging the research community to go and try to build some tools. Not having tools is pretty scary. So the version that you have in front of you, and I'll talk about this in a while, is deliberately weakened so that it's not evil and so that people can look at it in a few hours and understand what it can do. But if we have rampant GPU malware that has that we have no ability to analyze, it's a huge problem. So the real bad news is that until recently, there weren't any free tools to even dump GPU memory. So you don't even know what's in the device memory. So through some cooperation with NVIDIA that I'll talk about in a while, there's actually tools publicly available on a website link that I'll give you, so you can go and start playing with GPU memory dumping and get an idea of what the stuff is all about. So my point is that if, as a research encourager, this is a partial reboot for memory analysis because things like volatility are going to do basically nothing for GPU malware. If we write some new tools, then we can do stuff. So hey, this is another opportunity to make cool advances in memory analysis. On the flip side, it's a wake-up call that we currently don't have any tools for analyzing malicious instances of GPU malware. So you would think that this would strengthen defense a little bit, but it turns out not to have too much of an impact in general. GPUs are not completely autonomous, so the GPU code in general, the code that's executing on the GPU for NVIDIA GPU applications is called a GPU kernel. You can't have completely autonomous execution on the GPU, and that's actually a good thing because you can't have runaway code on your GPU that you can't manage, right? You're not really given any tools for killing things on the GPU, and that's because there's a host-side code requirement that drives some of the GPU stuff, and when the host-side app dies, the GPU application stops as well. The bad news in terms of defense is if you can basically hide something like this somewhere that just periodically tickles the GPU to run its stuff, that's really all you need. And so there's not going to be much on the host side to analyze to figure out what's happening in the GPU. It's going to be primarily just some driver. So backing up for a minute and talking about something that's already passed and to further motivate you maybe, I made a watered-down version of what will ultimately be the DFRWS challenge and presented this at the DFRWS Rodeo. So if you get a chance to attend DFRWS, it's a fantastic community. It's 150 or so researchers there. We have one event every year called the Forensic Rodeo where people basically drink beer and hack on some forensic scenario. This year's forensic scenario was GPU malware. Now, given that there's 2.5 hours or so to analyze stuff, you can't fling some never-before-seen malware on people and expect them to do something. So I made a contrived example, and I'll run you through that quickly to see what it's about. The idea is to take this stuff that I'm going to show you and then make it a lot harder to solve in order to drive more research to be developed. So the forensic scenarios, I'm going to just blaze through this because there's more to talk about. There's a fictitious company called Etouffee LLC that sells nasty frozen food, and it's owned by Niles Boudreau, and Chloe O'Brennan is the chief technologist there and the person that sets up the environment and does everything. Just around the time that Niles notices some suspicious financial transactions, Chloe O'Brennan goes missing and is gone. And outside there's a trash can that's on fire, and there's a bunch of source code in there that's burning up. And an investigator is assigned to the case who, because Chloe hacks in from outside while he's trying to do the network analysis and stuff, and he hasn't turned the network off, he suffers a heart attack. His head hits the computer system and actually bends the thumb drive of the thing that he was storing evidence on. So it's contrived, right? But I'm trying to make something that seems realistic enough to be fun for 2 hours. Another restriction is that Niles only uses links. How many people have used links before? Okay. So he only uses console mode Linux. He doesn't have any GUI and does all his web surfing like this, but you can see he's checking his financial transactions and stuff here, right? So the investigative questions are, what happened? Did Chloe do anything? And what data was exfiltrated? And all that stuff. So inside the burning trash can, I revealed this evidence in little pieces. That's Photoshop burning, by the way, not real fire, as you can see. Inside the trash can are fragments of the printout that you have in front of you. So there's stuff that if you sort of, I won't waste time, it's much easier to read on your printout, but if you look, you sort of see hints that something weird's going on, and you see a burned up page of the CUDA programming guide, so probably some GPU stuff is involved here, maybe if you knew about that. You see this weird chart of what looks like, I'll just tell you, looks like scan code stuff. Something's going on, right? So people are starting to get the idea of what's happening, and then other things happen, like a technician arrives and fixes the thumb drive, and so on the thumb drive there's a transcript of a CUDA GDB session. So CUDA GDB is a instrumentation of GDB that's released by NVIDIA for debugging GPU applications. So you can do traditional traditional GDB-based debugging against programs that are running in the GPU and on the host. So they see a bunch of stuff in this transcript that looks awfully like the keystrokes that are there, right? So probably there's something going on. And then toward the end, I even release a program for translating the keystrokes back into readable text and stuff for people that are just completely lost. Because the idea of the rodeo is no one should burst into tears. Everyone should have a really good time, right? So by this point, smart people have already solved it, but we're trying to lead everyone along. If you looked at the system using volatility or traditional live forensic tools, you'll see some weird stuff going on, but you won't be able to do too much analysis without help like this CUDA GDB stuff. And I'll come back to the limitations of why I made the environment so crazy, because it turns out that in many cases the CUDA GDB wouldn't be possible, and if it's not possible, then you're basically lost in terms of what's being stored in the GPU. So if you looked at the available memory analysis evidence, you'd see something strange. There's a root process. I made it run as root deliberately so it would stick out a little bit. It's called whoopsie with 3 O's. How many people know about the whoopsie with 2 O's? So on Ubuntu Linux, whoopsie with 2 O's is the crash reporter thing. When there's a system problem, it's responsible for notifying you and sending reports and all that stuff. Whoopsie's kind of a good name, right? So by adding an extra O, you do traditional bad hiding mechanisms that can be discovered easily, even under the influence of beer and time constraints. So the problem is dumping whoopsie and everything doesn't get you as much as you'd like, because a lot of the activity is happening inside the GPU. So punchline, as you already know, but they didn't know until the end, is that all that physical evidence, all the printouts that are half burned up, and the broken thumb drive and all that stuff points that you have GPU keystroke logging at play here. And this is in the style of GPU keystroke loggers that we've already seen in academic research, and the references are at the end. So you have a copy of this thing in your handout, and I wanted to give you the basic idea. And if you can't read C or don't want to read C, just avert your eyes for 2 or 3 slides. But if you're interested in doing keystroke logging against USB keyboards, there's a few basic facts, and this same structure would be used whether it's GPU malware or host-based malware or anything else. So when you plug in USB keyboards into a Linux machine, one of these struct URBs gets allocated, and there's a few fields that we're interested in there. The one that's most important is this transfer DMA field here, which for USB keyboards points at an 8-byte buffer. The first byte of that buffer is modifier keys that encode shift, control, alt, all the non-printing things. And then there's a 6-character buffer at the end and a mysterious byte that's not used. How many people have something like an X-Arcade controller or any kind of multi-button video game controller? No one? One common thing that people gripe about is these USB-attached video game controllers don't work very well when you press down lots and lots of buttons at the same time, like you and your friend are beating on all the buttons at the same time. That's because it's, the hardware limitation here is 6 buttons down at a time for USB keyboards, and that's all that can be encoded. So if you look in your nasty printout, don't have to do it now if you don't want to, you'll see this horrible block of code that looks like that blue thing that's there. Some of the academic research on this doesn't give you the correct recipe. There's a few pieces that are missing. I'm not going to point out things, but it's important to get the recipe right. The basic idea is this is a carving pattern for, if you're familiar with like forensic carving, this is a carving pattern for finding one of these things in physical memory. So the parts you can't see up there, we're sweeping across all physical memory, finding a structure that matches certain patterns. If you want to just latch on to one very specific thing, it's the word keyboard that's there. That's really helpful. That's not enough context, right? Because you're going to find the word keyboard all over the place. But all these other checks make it all work out. In English, it's something like if certain fields are aligned on certain boundaries and the buffer is 8 bytes in length, that's a USB keyboard indicator, and I actually see the word keyboard, and all these things are true, then I've probably found that structure. Okay, so this is how the malware works then. Even though I'm running that process as root so that this is easily detected in 2 hours, as I said before, to make USB DMA-based keystroke loggers work, you need root access only for a couple seconds. You need access to sweep across memory, find that struct URB, which contains the link to the 8-byte buffer where keystrokes are going to be appearing. And what we do basically is do a simple memory allocation in the host space, in the host-based process, right? And then with the help of a kernel module, you can see the arrow switching here, we're basically redirecting the physical address in the page table entry associated with that memory allocation to the struct URB DMA buffer field. So now what you have is a user space process that has access to the 8-byte buffer where keystrokes will appear. Now we don't want to keep that activity in user space because it's easily detected. So what you're doing instead is feeding the address to the GPU. Now the GPU just monitors the DMA address and stores all the keystrokes in GPU RAM. So you don't see any indication whatsoever of the keystroke data in user space, and you can look in volatility to the end of time and you won't find anything that indicates that, that things are being logged. And the really difficult thing is that the components that you're left with after all the other parts are blown away is you see this user space thing calling some CUDA thing and passing it some V, right? And you see a GPU thing that basically looks like it's just examining some elements of an array. You don't see any fancy network or file I/O or any patterns being searched for or anything. It looks like a very boring computation that's actually doing bad stuff by logging all keystrokes. So the question then is, why is this such a big deal, and why don't we just use CUDA GDB and the problem is solved, right? Because it looked like that was pretty simple in the example I showed from the rodeo. So we want to know what if I didn't make such a contrived example, and what if Niles, like every other human being, actually uses a GUI and has Windows running and uses Internet Explorer or Firefox or whatever. And why did I do all that stuff? Was it just to be eccentric, or was there some reason? And I think you have a clue about what would have happened if old school forensics had taken hold and the guy would have just jerked the plug out. You'd never have any evidence whatsoever of Chloe's activities, probably, right? Except for the physical evidence. Physical memory dumps are not going to help you much. You'll see the host side component, but you won't see any of the data that's actually in the GPU. So here's the deal. First of all, that process didn't have to run as root, and user space code that you're seeing could have been injected somewhere and been much harder to find. All the CUDA GDB stuff requires debugging symbols to work, and if you strip those, the tools don't work anymore. The kernel module that you see being explicitly loaded from user space could have come from some other source as just pure data and been injected as a kernel module and then disappeared. You can't debug CUDA applications that have terminated. So if you did something like rebooted the machine, all the keystrokes are still in the GPU memory, and the GPU malware is now dead. But there's no way to see the data that's there because the process is dead. If you started a debugging session against a live GPU process and make a mistake and crash it, then your ability to debug it is now gone. And there are many, many more restrictions, like on a machine that has a single GPU, unless you do a whole bunch of preparatory steps, I can't debug things if I have a GUI running. Thus the reason that Niles uses links and stuff like that, right? Yeah, so there's many, many things that are necessary for the debugging to work properly. And of course, malware is going to take none of the precautionary steps to make it easy to analyze, or else you wouldn't have bothered with this in the first place. So coming to some of the good news here, we do have some tools already. CUDA object dump and NV disassembler can generate, I know how small this is, can generate, this is a tiny little snip of this, can generate disassemblies of the intermediate level assembler that's used for the CUDA stuff that's running in the GPU. But we, honestly, does anyone have expertise with this stuff yet? So my experience in teaching reverse engineering is that already there's a big gap in Intel assembler and just basic assembler on host machines. Now you have a whole brand new, poorly documented language to learn, right? Potentially problematic. So, running toward conclusion, the challenge is coming. It was intentionally originally going to be released earlier, and how hard this has turned out to be, eluded me at first and no longer. But we basically have some materials now for pushing this research forward, and that's what I'll talk about next. So it'd be really nice if one of us, talked to NVIDIA and said, hey, we'd love some tools for dumping GPU memory. And they just responded and said, yeah, that'd be awesome. Let's do that. So I sent a mail to NVIDIA and expected nothing and got an almost immediate response back like, how can we help? So in fact, at this point, after a bunch of conference calls and a bunch of technical discussions about what's needed and stuff, and me signing an NDA that will send me to somewhere forever if people misbehave, tools are released. So there's a long link and a small link there, and I'll have them on the end slide again. But basically, we now have, thanks to NVIDIA's graciousness and interest in trying to develop these tools, because they also know that it's important to remediate this problem, right? We now have tools, dump FB, that can take starting and length and GPU identifiers and dump GPU RAM. So now, if we want to, we can dump all the keystrokes out, whether the malware is dead or not. So you simply run the provided one of the provided utilities that gets installed when you install all the NVIDIA stuff, and then use this alpha version of dump FB to dump stuff out. So if we, for example, let that GPU keystroke logger run, and it has a 1 gig buffer, and I explained to my child recently how much data 1 gigabyte is. It's a lot. It's about 585 copies of the 900-page memory analysis book if you only look at the text. So it's a lot. So we're running the keystroke logger with 1 gig of buffer, and we're also injecting another 585 copies of that book into the GPU, and then running this memory dumping stuff, and sure enough, there's the text of the book. And if you reboot, there's the text of the book. And if you reboot again, there's the text of the book. And if you look further and do a little decoding, there's the text of the stuff that that Niles was typing, including doing things like linking to capital1.com, and you know, you see his password there, Niles richer than Beyonce, and all that stuff. So, and bragging about the fact that he's super rich and a sellout and all that stuff. So yeah, these are it'll be posted. This is a little hard to read there. These are some related work, including the references for the published examples of GPU malware that have been developed in the academic community. These are papers to read about GPU malware, including a really interesting one that came out this year that only looks at textures that are stored in GPU RAM and deduces what web pages that you've visited, because, say, Google's header has certain colors and stuff that render certain textures in the GPU RAM, and now I know you visited Google. So pretty unexpected. Yeah, and if you go and look at those links, and this is just beginning, but if you monitor GPU malware as a tag on Twitter, all the developments about the challenge are going to be posted there. And feel free to contact me if you have interest or questions. But yeah, we're trying to get something going here and encourage people to develop new tools. And you know, tool writing is fun. So that's it for me. Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, me. So you said you saw some GPU malware in the wild?
It's mainly Bitcoin mining stuff at this point,
all right.
right? Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Thanks for listening. Thanks.